The Me-163 Komet is the only rocket-powered fighter to ever enter operational service. The short-range German interceptor was the fastest and one of the most radical aircraft of World War II. Despite its record-setting speed, the fighters were in as much danger of blowing up from their volatile engine fuel as they were of being shot down by Allied fire. Their rocket-propellant mixture was so flammable that the aircraft sometimes combusted out of thin air. And regardless of several state-of-the-art weapons installed in their fuselage, the Komets were so fast that shooters could not aim properly at their much slower enemies. But Luftwaffe pilots were still impressed by the Komet's technological superiority, and even more excited about being able to fly a rocket, even at the cost of their own lives. Wunderwaffen. The concept of a Nazi interceptor aircraft dates back to the late 1930s, when the development of rocket propulsion theories attracted German aircraft companies. Although they showed great potential, rocket-powered aircraft interceptors posed insurmountable difficulties at the time due to their high and fast fuel consumption rates. But regardless of their limitations, the Reich Air Ministry funded pioneering rocket engine designer Helmut Walter's research. In 1936, Walter was issued a contract to develop an 882-pound thrust motor designed to power the Henkel HE-176 aircraft. With designation code RI-203, the engine was powered with a mixture of T-Stoff. The substance was composed of 80% hydrogen peroxide and 20% water, with trace amounts of oxyquinoline or phosphate as a stabilizer, and Z-Stoff, a combination of calcium or sodium permanganate with water. Because the Henkel HE-176 had been designed entirely as a high-speed aircraft with no military potential, the Reich Air Ministry ordered the German Research Institute for Gliding Flight, or DFS, to produce another prototype version. However, this variant would be based on the Lippisch Delta IV, a tailless aircraft designed by aeronautical engineer Dr. Alexander Lippisch. The prototype, named DFS-39, would also be rocket-fueled and produced under a highly secretive program dubbed Project X. The DFS would design the wings due to Lippisch's experience with the Delta Wing, while Henkel aircraft manufacturers would work on the rest of the aircraft. However, Lippisch soon realized that the DFS-39's wing-mounted rudders would cause flutter and several malfunctions. The model was then replaced by the DFS-194, which had a conventional vertical stabilizer installed in the fuselage. Like its predecessor, the DFS-194 was also intended to be a conventionally powered flying testbed for future rocket-fueled designs. Communication between the Henkel company and the DFS eventually broke down. Tired of so much secrecy, Dr. Lippisch requested to leave the institute and join the Messerschmitt AG Aircraft Manufacturing Corporation for the remainder of the project. Messerschmitt. The Reich granted Dr. Lippisch's request on January 2, 1939. Soon after, Lippisch arrived at the Messerschmitt headquarters in Augsburg, along with his design team and the partially finished DFS-194, which was renamed to Me-163. After a series of successful unpowered test flights, the model's success spurred the development of the first official prototype of the rocket-powered Me-163, which was completed by early 1941. Flight testing began in the spring when the Me-163 was fitted with the Walter RR-1203 engine for a series of rocket-fueled trials. Despite its motor's unreliability, which caused a series of accidents and explosions due to its T-Stoff fuel's flammability, the aircraft's initial flights revealed excellent results. Then, on October 2, 1941, the Me-163 set a new world record by reaching a speed of 623.8 miles per hour. The Reich's new interceptor. Impressed by the aircraft's performance, the Reich Ministry of Aviation commanded Dr. Lippisch to design an improved version of the Me-163 with an even more powerful rocket motor developed by Helmut Walter. The redesign was named Komet Me-163B, and it would be an operational Nazi interceptor aircraft. Although its landing gear was similar to its predecessor, it employed a wheeled trolley device jettisoned after takeoff and an expandable skid for landing. However, The biggest concern about the new design was its short flight time. With a maximum of 7 minutes of powered flight, the fighter was a dedicated point defense interceptor. The model's first prototype was completed in April of 1942. Still, it could not yet fly, as its motor would not be ready for installation until late fall. This new Volter 109-509A motor used an even more volatile fuel blend of T-Stoff and C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate, methyl alcohol, and water. The concoction provided a maximum thrust of 3,300 pounds. Unlike the earlier motor, which directed all the oxygen and water vapors produced by the hydrogen peroxide's chemical disintegration out of the engine's nozzle, the newer one used said oxygen and ignited it for additional thrust efficiency. Both the C-Stoff and T-Stoff fuels were transparent, corrosive, and toxic to the touch, and highly volatile when mixed, even at room temperature. The chemicals were so delicate that the Me-163 sometimes spontaneously exploded on the tarmac. The mixture also ignited organic fibers and dissolved flesh. As Dr. Lippisch said, quote, "If you stick your finger in it, then you only get the bone out." To prevent explosions and avoid injuries, the pilots wore special protective gear and were on a strict diet to minimize natural gas production. Flight testing of the first rocket-fueled Me-163 took place during the remainder of 1942. The trials continued to demonstrate the dangers of the C-Stoff and T-Stoff propulsion system. As the fuel passed through the engine's pumps, vacuum areas sometimes formed in the liquid, which caused a catastrophic explosion when the engine was started. Landing the Komet also proved to be troublesome. Numerous pilots suffered back injuries upon touchdown due to malfunctions in its jettisoning takeoff wheels and expanding skid. Landings were performed without power and at high speed, requiring the utmost care on the pilot's part to prevent the aircraft from overturning on soft ground. Due to its highly volatile fuel, Me-163 pilots had no choice but to become experts at dead-stick landings. Despite its 7-minute flight capacity and 25-mile operational range, the Komet was still incredibly fast. In 1944, a Komet reportedly achieved 702 miles per hour during a dive. The unofficial record wasn't broken until 3 years later, when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier flying a Bell X-1. The Luftwaffe was ready to send the Me-163 Komet to combat. Operational failings. The first series of Komets began deployment in early 1944. They first saw combat that summer during an interception operation with B-17 Flying Fortresses. By the end of August, an entire wing of Komets, commanded by Major Wolfgang Speer, was deployed to Brandis and Berg Stargard to defend the Reich's top synthetic fuel plants, Luna and Prillitz. By then, Allied top brass had figured out that fuel was the Komet's main weakness. They then orchestrated an attack on Germany's sole C-Stoff plant, which caused a fuel shortage and prevented several Me-163s from continuing operating. German Test Unit Commander Captain Wolfgang Speer was told, quote, "Our only supply is what's left in storage at the different airfields and depots. We have enough here at Brandis for about another 50 fully loaded flights." The Komet was also too fast to be an accurate bomber. It flew 400 miles per hour faster than the bombers it was trying to hunt down. While using its short-range cannons, the Komet pilot only had a small 2.5-second window to aim before it was past its target. Captain Speer would later state, quote, "There just wasn't enough time to get off a well-aimed shot. Whenever our pilots got a chance to fire, they were either still out of gun range or were already too close." The Me-163s would usually dive down in Allied bomber formations in coordinated hit-and-run attacks and quickly fly back to their base before their fuel ran out. Allied fighter bombers stood no chance of keeping up with the speedy Komets. Still, they did perfect a maneuver to follow the Nazi aircraft back to their airfields and then strafe them when they were at their most vulnerable while performing their landing approaches. Jagdfaust rifle. In one last attempt to solve the Komet's accuracy complications, the Reich Air Ministry tried several methods to achieve more successful shootdowns. The Germans eventually settled on the Sondergerät 500, Jägerfaust, the most promising weapon out of these exercises. Often referred to as Jagdfaust by the Allies, the airborne anti-bomber recoilless rifle included 10 single-shot, short-barreled 50mm guns pointing upwards, of which 5 were mounted on each side of the wings. A photo cell installed on the plane's upper surface triggered the guns when it detected a change in brightness levels as the Komet flew under a bomber. This weapon system is credited with just one successful downing. On April 10, 1945, Komet pilot Lieutenant Fritz Kelb downed a Royal Air Force Avro Lancaster bomber. But despite the Jagdfaust's accuracy and its promising future, the weapon arrived too late to actually have any significant impact on the war. The rifle was only installed on 2 Me-163s. As Kelb later stated, quote, "This was the one and only time that this weapon system was used in the air. Too late." Off-duty. Komet pilots claimed 16 unconfirmed aerial victories, mostly taking down B-17 Flying Fortresses and de Havilland Mosquitoes. In stark contrast, only between 6 and 9 Me-163s were shot down during combat, mainly by P-51 Mustangs. 9 more aircraft were lost to combustion accidents. In the end, the Luftwaffe recognized that the Komet's speed was its most significant fault, and that the slower Me-262 turbojet fighters were more straightforward and practical than the short-ranged Me-163s. The Komet's combat missions became limited to hunting down Allied reconnaissance aircraft, as the Me-163B was one of very few German aircraft that could put up with Royal Air Force Mosquitoes in level flight. Only 1 month before Germany's surrender in 1945, all Komets were officially pulled from duty. In total, 364 jets had been built, but less than a quarter ever saw combat. The Komet's blueprint and a prototype were eventually shared with the Japanese Air Force. Although Mitsubishi and Yokoi Aircraft Company evaluated and seriously considered them, none were ever produced. The Komet remains the only rocket-fueled fighter aircraft to have entered operational service. But despite breaking records during its early testing phase, the Komet remains a lesson in being careful to focus on one single attribute above all others. Captain Spete would later say of his pilots, quote, "They were all filled with an intractable urge to serve their fatherland in a special way. They were ready to give their lives in order to fulfill their dream of flying in a rocket."